told the following story based on Vincent's words and conversations overheard at his bedside. During the afternoon, in the deep path that lies along the wall of the chateau, Vincent shot himself and fainted. The coolness of the night revived him. On all fours, he looked for the gun to finish himself off, but he could not find it. Vincent then got up and climbed down the hillside to return to our house. This answers very few of the questions surrounding his death, questions which today remain unanswered. How could the gun have fallen so far from his hands that he couldn't find it? Why didn't anyone else find the gun that day or the next? What about the missing easel, canvas, and paints? When Vincent arrived at the inn, he was not dripping blood along his path, nor were there signs of blood on his clothes. How could Vincent have laid, allegedly with a gunshot wound, for several hours and produced so little blood? There was a steep wooden slope between the inn and the fields. It would have taken significant physical effort to walk on this slope. If Vincent was wounded and barely conscious, surely he wouldn't have been able to make this journey. Furthermore, where and when did Vincent get a gun? Why did he shoot himself? If Van Gogh had meant to shoot himself in the heart, he had missed wildly. Based on his wound, the barrel of the gun had been held below his heart and pointed downward. A group of researchers actually recreated the gunshot and found a number of problems, but we'll talk about those in great detail later. In fairness, Vincent had thought about suicide before. Indeed, he had threatened it outright many years prior, but his conclusions were always invariably against the idea. Time and time again, he categorized suicide as weak and terrible. Vincent believed suicide to be a crime against art itself. This is significant because Vincent had passionately, obsessively dedicated his life to art. In one letter, Vincent described himself as someone who has come too close to suicide to ever really do it. "I am trying to recover," he wrote, "like someone who is meant to commit suicide but then makes for the bank because he finds the water too cold." It's worth noting that every time the idea of suicide came into Vincent's mind, it approached in the same form: drowning. Every time he had thought of the act, he had threatened drowning. This happened time and time again, even once saying the only type of suicide he could understand was drowning. There was a river near the inn. Surely if Vincent had resolved to suicide, he would have drowned himself in that river. There was also a serious lack of preparation for death on the part of Vincent. His final letters to Theo had been boisterous. He had written plans for the future, including a request for more paint. His last paintings were vibrant depictions of country life. Vincent was obsessed his whole life with writing letters. He spent much of his time expressing his every action in writing, but there was no suicide note in his room. There also exists a litany of problems with the gun itself. It's said that Vincent shot himself with a revolver. At the time, a revolver was still a novelty in the south of France. It would have been worth a significant amount of money. It was not a gun that someone would simply lend away. Indeed, no one in the town recalled seeing Vincent with a gun, and no stores or individuals admitted to selling or giving him the weapon. In later years, claims arose about Vincent borrowing a gun to, quote, scare away crows, or that he had threatened townspeople with a similar gun, or still that he himself had owned the revolver through his whole life. But these are baseless claims. There's absolutely no evidence that any of these things are true. In the days following the incident, locals inventoried every gun, and one was indeed missing. Years later, its owner would claim that Vincent had stolen the gun, but this was never verified in any meaningful way. It's simply a rumor. Furthermore, when the doctor arrived at the inn, Vincent seemed to have no interest in dying. Rather, he screamed and begged for someone to remove the bullet from his body. He desperately wanted surgery. Van Gogh could have been transported to war-trained surgeons 20 miles away in Paris to get medical attention, surgeons who likely would have saved his life. Instead, Vincent's doctor, a Dr. Gachet, refused to perform surgery. Instead, he let Vincent lie in bed, in agony, dying for 30 hours. Moving Van Gogh would have come with risks, but Vincent was dying. the worst outcome of moving him was the same as the already accepted outcome. Yet, he remained in place. While this hints more towards medical negligence than homicide, it is a detail that further obfuscates Vincent's death. There was a story that persisted around town long after Vincent died. The story claimed two young boys had accidentally shot Vincent while playing with a gun. The boys had never come forward because they feared being accused of murder. The conclusion was therefore that Van Gogh had protected them in his final act. This would have expressed a sort of generosity that Vincent had indeed displayed throughout his life. This is, of course, just another rumor and should be taken with a grain of salt, but it would answer more questions than the theory of suicide. Admittedly, though, all of this is just conjecture and circumstantial evidence. Nothing I've said entirely rules out suicide. But that is where we arrive at the topic of modern forensics.
I'm not on my parents' health insurance anymore, and I work for myself doing a bit of everything. So I found a plan for just $34 a month.
All plans cover doctor visits, prescriptions.
2020, a group of researchers published a study on the death of Vincent van Gogh. In this study, the researchers examined all surviving evidence, circumstantial and physical. They also recreated the gunshot that killed Van Gogh. Working alongside a medical staff, the researchers came to this conclusion. It is therefore our opinion, based on that limited information, that in all medical probability, the cause of death is not a self-inflicted wound by Vincent van Gogh, and thus in all medical probability, a homicide. By his attending physician, Van Gogh's wound was noted to be pea-sized with a red concentric margin surrounded by a bluish-brown ring. The physician did not describe any black gunpowder burns on the skin or clothing around the wound. When Van Gogh died, guns used black powder ammunition. Fired at close range, these guns left powder burns tattooed onto the flesh. If Vincent had shot himself at point-blank range, a powder burn would have been virtually impossible to avoid. You could argue that the physician just omitted the mention of the powder burn at his own discretion. But the examination of powder burns was an essential technique used by police and doctors of Van Gogh's era. If such a burn had existed on Van Gogh, it would have absolutely been recorded. The lack of a powder burn alone makes it extremely unlikely that Van Gogh could have shot himself. In fact, the policeman who examined Vincent's wound personally concluded that the artist was shot from 1 to 2 feet away. But in response, Van Gogh claimed that he shot himself, and so the record reflected his words. In 1960, a French farmer found an old rusted and bent revolver in a wheat field outside of the town where Vincent had died. It was an era-appropriate weapon found vaguely close to the place Van Gogh died. Despite a lack of actual evidence, experts at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam considered it likely to be the gun Vincent used. So the researchers in the 2020 study procured that same gun to recreate Van Gogh's wound. They fired the gun into FBI-grade ballistics gel from a variety of distances. The gel was also covered in cotton fabric to simulate the clothing Van Gogh would have been wearing. As expected, the point-blank firing produced a significant powder burn. 6, 12, and 18-inch distances produced decreasingly present burns, with the burn disappearing entirely at 12 inches. So based on the absence of the powder burn, Van Gogh must have been shot at a distance of at least 12 inches. A person could hold a gun from that distance and shoot themselves. The researchers thus explored this possibility, but quickly eliminated it. Based on the records of Van Gogh's examining physician, the researchers had a good understanding of the bullet's trajectory as it moved through Vincent's body. To create this trajectory and fire the gun from 12 inches away, Vincent would have had to contort his body in a way that was virtually impossible. Put quite simply, given the gun and a will to suicide, Vincent could not have produced the wound that killed him. The unfortunate reality is that none of this proves anything, and nor will it ever. We will always know that Van Gogh died of a gunshot wound, but we will never know who fired that gun. The circumstantial doubts about Van Gogh's death are just that, circumstantial. These unanswered questions cast immense doubt on the idea of suicide, but do not eliminate it entirely. They could all be answered with some varying stretches of the imagination. The forensic study likewise has problems. By the researcher's own admittance, there is only so much evidence available for a 150-year-old case. Most of the facts are eyewitness reports or first-hand accounts that have likely been manipulated by time. To get more substantial information, the body of Van Gogh would need to be exhumed, and even then, it's unlikely there would be any true final verdict. I also think that Van Gogh's history of mental illness complicates matters. If any action of his seems illogical or unlikely, that could be quite easily explained by his lifelong predisposition for acting irrationally. We can never know what happened in that field. The two options seem to be homicide or suicide. But either of these was a cruelty horrifically and uniquely tailored to Vincent himself. Modern psychologists have provided a variety of diagnoses for Vincent van Gogh. Psychosis, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia have all been suggested. But ultimately, Vincent's afflictions meant much of his life was stolen from him. His actions and his thoughts were touched by monsters, polluted and put out of even his own reach. Vincent was rarely more than a man violently strapped into the passenger seat of his own life. In death, Vincent did not find any more agency nor peace. He was ultimately throttled and thrown into an abyss. Whether by suicide or homicide, we can only be sure that Vincent died as helplessly as he lived. Far more than our eternal unknowing, this is the true tragedy of Vincent van Gogh.
Let's be real. Life can get tough to say the least, and especially without someone to talk to. And as men, this topic seems to be brushed off when it doesn't need to be that way. And so that is why I recommend starting therapy with BetterHelp. Because as a guy, we're often taught to carry all this weight on our shoulders to figure it out on your own.
Much has been written about the life of Ernest Hemingway. Some paint him as a hyper-masculine adventurer. Others say he was a womanizing, chauvinist degenerate. Both of these are basically accurate, but wildly incomplete. Even if you haven't read any of his books, and even if you don't give a damn about Hemingway as an individual, there's a lot to learn from the modern myth of Ernest Hemingway, about how we see people and how we interpret the choices they make. Because beyond the modern caricature, there is a more profound and rarely told story of Ernest Hemingway. A tragic story about a man predestined to destroy himself. Through a number of factors well outside of his control, Hemingway was doomed from the start. But by approaching the life and times of Ernest Hemingway with empathy and compassion, we can unravel the truth about one of history's most impactful creatives. The New York Times called Ernest Hemingway the most significant author since Shakespeare. Born in the American Midwest, Hemingway led a truly outrageous life. He was in both world wars and had a lifelong fascination with bullfighting. He became a deep-sea fisherman in the Caribbean. The man survived 2 plane crashes and hunted big game in Africa. Hemingway had 4 marriages. While it wasn't always pretty, there can be no doubt. Ernest Hemingway lived life on the edge. He channeled these experiences into his work. Hemingway showed a huge talent for writing from a young age. Throughout his life, his novels and short stories reached astonishing heights of critical and commercial success. He was a superstar. At the end of all of this, Hemingway ended his own life with a shotgun. We can never truly understand why a person commits suicide. But by examining each part of his life and his world, we can understand the circumstances that forged Ernest Hemingway.
Hey, Ben Stiller here. Right now, millions of refugees and displaced families are facing dangerous winter weather, and they need our help.
In the memoir A Movable Feast, Hemingway wrote, "Families have many ways of being dangerous." Indeed, Hemingway's family was just that, dangerous. Ernest Hemingway was born to Dr. Clarence and Grace Hemingway. He was one of 6 children. As soon as you examine his parents and then his siblings, very disturbing patterns begin to emerge. Dr. Clarence Hemingway was a strict Christian conservative and a vicious disciplinarian who likely suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder. He would spank and beat his son with a leather strap. Clarence suffered from abrupt, serious mood swings. These depressive episodes required him to spend large amounts of time in isolation, living far away from the Hemingways' Illinois home. Throughout Hemingway's life, his father expressed disdain for almost everything that the author produced. In one instance, he called a short story of Ernest's filth that should not have been published anywhere. Ernest's opinion of his father seemed to swing wildly throughout his life. There were times in childhood and adulthood when he admired Clarence Hemingway. But notably, as a child, Ernest had a ritual. Ernest would hide in his family's shed with a shotgun. He would line his father's head up in the sights of the loaded firearm as if a sort of mock assassination of his own father. Throughout his life, Dr. Clarence had a recurring, crippling battle with depression. In his 50s, he lost that battle once and for all. Dr. Clarence took his own life, shooting himself in the head with a pistol. This is perhaps the moment that divides Ernest's life into a BC and AD. When his father died, Ernest remarked that it was as if his own life had been shot out from under him. After this incident, his alcoholism and destructive personality traits snowballed like never before. Indeed, he began to express sympathy for his father's decision, but we will discuss that more later. Ernest hated his mother, Grace Hemingway, not in the way that a spoiled teenager hates their mom, but in a deep, unrelenting, and permanent way. As a boy, Grace insisted that Ernest be dressed like a girl. She had his hair cut short like a girl's. On the back of a photograph of young Ernest wearing a lace dress, Grace wrote the words, "Summer Girl." Grace even attempted to pass her son off as the twin of his older sister, Marceline. She was obsessed with this idea. Grace had Marceline held back a year in school so that the siblings would be in the same grade. But at the same time, she would praise Ernest for displaying masculine behavior. She complimented his skill at hunting, fishing, and lauded him for his love of manly outdoor activities. Ernest's rage toward his mother began at a young age. Grace would often refer to Ernest as, quote, Dutch Dolly, while the boy called his mother Fweetie. At the age of 2, Grace once called Ernest Dutch Dolly, and he responded with, "I'm not Dutch Dolly. Bang, bang. I shoot Fweetie." So in his childhood, Ernest expressed a desire to shoot both of his parents. When his father committed suicide, Ernest blamed his mother entirely. In numerous communications, journals, and letters, Ernest would later refer to his mother as "that bitch" and said that her controlling, domineering personality drove his father to kill himself. This hatred never eased. Looking at other members of the Hemingway family, it's easy to see a pattern of intense psychiatric disability. His mother, Grace, suffered from anxiety and insomnia. 2 of Ernest's uncles struggled with similar issues. 2 of Ernest's 5 siblings committed suicide. A third died in 1963, officially due to natural causes, but the family strongly suspected suicide. So of the 6 Hemingway children, 4 of them committed suicide. It is likely that Ernest and his own father both suffered from bipolar disorder. Ernest Hemingway's youngest son, Gregory, was diagnosed with this same condition during his life. Although a practicing doctor, Gregory lost his medical license after having uncontrollable substance abuse issues. Throughout his life, Gregory's struggles led to multiple psychiatric hospitalizations and arrests. He eventually died of natural causes in a Miami jail. Ernest's granddaughter suffered from bulimia, depression, and a seizure disorder before eventually killing herself. That was 6 suicides in 4 generations of the Hemingway family.
Shalom, friend. Today I wanted to give you a wonderful gift, the Jewish book of First Enoch. This is a fascinating book. Perhaps you're aware that the New
Hemingway was born with a generational talent for writing, but he was also born with a litany of incurable, eventually fatal mental disorders. Throughout his life, Ernest self-reported depressive episodes over and over again. In one letter, he told a friend, "I felt that gigantic bloody emptiness and nothingness. If it couldn't ever fuck, fight, right, it was all for death." This is just one example, but he would go on to report profound instances of depression throughout his life. Hemingway's first major biographer categorized him as a temperamental manic depressive and said that he swung wildly forever between megalomania and melancholy. This biographer wrote that his mood swung so quickly that he may as well have been exhilarated and depressed at the same time. This radical swinging would manifest itself in his work too. Hemingway often described a feeling of juice and said it was as bad as any disease. With this quote, juice, Hemingway could produce massive amounts of truly masterful writing in very short amounts of time. His novel, The Sun Also Rises, is often seen as a masterpiece. Hemingway wrote this book in just 8 weeks. These were likely undiagnosed manic episodes. One of Hemingway's wives wrote that the protagonist of his depression was his liver. For virtually his entire life, Hemingway suffered from severe alcohol dependence. He likely began drinking as a teenager. After joining World War I in 1917, Ernest enjoyed cognac and whiskey with his friends and comrades. Hemingway was shot full of shrapnel during his service. While in treatment, he bribed the hospital porter to smuggle cognac in on his behalf. For a young 20-something, this was not particularly alarming. But after his father's suicide, drinking became an everyday activity. He was eventually told by a doctor that his liver was failing. The doctor told Ernest to abstain from drinking, but the author was unable to follow this suggestion. Ernest's third wife left him because of his drinking. Shortly thereafter, a doctor wrote to Hemingway, "My dear Ernie, you must stop drinking alcohol. This is definitely of the utmost importance." Fortunately, Ernest was never able to control his drinking. Today, researchers think that Hemingway's unceasing alcoholism permanently altered his brain chemistry, forcing open the faucet of psychosis towards the end of his life. Still, though, we are only scratching the surface of Hemingway's issues. In addition to the horrific mental issues that plagued Hemingway from birth, life presented him with a number of physical injuries. These most certainly had a significant effect on his overall mood, wellness, and even his brain chemistry. Hemingway was an ambulance driver in World War I. While delivering cigarettes to frontline trenches, a mortar exploded and sent 237 pieces of shrapnel into Hemingway's leg. While the medics were transporting him to a hospital on a stretcher, Hemingway's body was shot several times by enemy gunfire. After returning from the war to his home in Oak Park, Illinois, Hemingway's friends agreed that he had been wounded psychologically just as much as physically. Hemingway had been injured at nighttime in the war. For the rest of his life, he slept with a nightlight, saying that the darkness caused his soul to leap from his body. Hemingway was also terrified to sleep alone till the day he died. Likely due to his lifelong alcoholism, Hemingway was terrifically accident-prone. While living in Paris with his wife, Hemingway arose from bed at night and walked to the bathroom. He mistook the skylight cord for the toilet's flush box chain. Hemingway yanked on it and the entire skylight fell onto his head. He received a laceration that required 9 stitches and he was left with a scar on his forehead. In 1944, he was a passenger in a drunken car accident. He was not driving, but his body was sent through the windshield of the car, causing a concussion and a severe laceration. Less than 3 months later, he was thrown from a motorcycle in Normandy. This proved to be another traumatic brain injury. For several months afterward, he experienced tinnitus, headaches, slurred speech, blurred vision, and memory loss. In 1945, he was behind the wheel of his car in Cuba when the vehicle slid into an embankment. The metal rear view mirror lacerated Hemingway's forehead. In 1950, Hemingway was on board his boat, the Pilar, when he slipped and fell. His head struck the deck of his boat, and he received yet another concussion. 4 years later, on safari in Africa, Hemingway experienced his worst brain injury. His plane crashed in Nairobi. Ernest sprained his back, his right arm, and his right shoulder. Thankfully, no one in his party was seriously injured, so they boarded a second plane, which also crashed. As the plane burned on the ground, Hemingway attempted to escape through the plane's door by battering it with his head. During this, he lacerated his scalp and fractured his skull. As he smashed his skull into the metal door, spinal fluid began to leak from his ear. The crash left him with temporary deafness, blurred vision, and serious injuries to his brain, liver, spleen, and kidneys. Altogether, throughout his life, Hemingway suffered from 6 traumatic brain injuries. Combined with alcoholism and a litany of mental disorders, Hemingway's problems are becoming very clear. All of these things happened in a world that, quite frankly, didn't give a shit. Mental health care was virtually non-existent in Hemingway's time. This is apparent in the fact that no doctors of the age were able to recognize Hemingway's symptoms or provide him with a diagnosis for any mental disorders. There are no records of any doctor conducting serious psychological tests on Ernest Hemingway. A person could put the blame on Hemingway himself. If you want a diagnosis, you need to go seek one, right? Well, Hemingway did see a number of doctors for physical ailments over the years, but the world in which he lived was very different than today's. To seek psychological help as a man in the early 20th century was simply unthinkable. It was to throw away your masculinity and dignity. Eventually, though, Hemingway agreed to see a psychologist at the Mayo Clinic. That doctor's solution was 10 rounds of electroconvulsive therapy. This therapy would ultimately lead to Hemingway's suicide.
The Enneagram is a personality assessment which helps you identify your core motivation.
Hemingway carried a lifelong fascination with suicide and death. His earliest short stories dealt with suicide quite heavily. Of his 7 completed novels, 5 end with the death of the male protagonist. After his father killed himself, that fascination seemed to only increase. In 1923, while living in Paris, he wrote to his creative collaborator Gertrude Stein, "I understand for the first time how men can commit suicide, simply because too many things in business piling up ahead of them that they can't get through." The following year, he made another remark about suicide in a letter to his friend Ezra. "I still claim that anyone that wants to can do it. Things are looking better, and I look forward to not giving a demonstration of my theory for some time." Years later, Hemingway wrote of suicide again in a letter to a friend. "Me, I like life very much. So much it will be a big disgust when I have to shoot myself. Maybe pretty soon, I guess." This was written decades before he shot himself. It seems like, on some level, Hemingway had already accepted or decided that his life would one day end in suicide. Perhaps his father's suicide had cemented the idea that it was always an option. Towards the end of his life, he began to talk more about suicide as he was increasingly losing his battle with depression. He wrote to a friend, "I'll tell you, Hotch, it's like being in a Kafka nightmare. I act cheerful like always, but I'm not. I'm bone-tired and very beat up emotionally." He openly brought up suicide with his doctors, who implored him to check into a psychiatric hospital. Initially, he refused. But in the final years of Hemingway's life, the author lived in extreme pain. Tremendous physical pain throughout his entire body, likely due to a then undiagnosed illness called hemochromatosis. Among the many symptoms of hemochromatosis, there is depression. It is likely that proper treatment for this illness would have also alleviated this depression. Hemingway was never diagnosed and never treated for hemochromatosis. At the Mayo Clinic, Hemingway experienced liver, heart, and kidney damage, diabetes, arthritis, and of course, deep and intense depression. It was here that he was given shock therapy. After receiving 10 rounds of this primitive treatment, Hemingway was discharged and seemed to be doing better, but his depression quickly returned, worse than ever. He could not summon the words to write and would often break down in tears at his typewriter. Years of brain trauma, alcohol abuse, and now electroconvulsive therapy in a world that did not care or know how to handle him had robbed Hemingway of his greatest gift. The ability which had given him reason to live was now gone. In April of 1961, Hemingway's wife thwarted his first attempt at suicide when she found him loading a shotgun. He was hospitalized immediately. At the hospital, he asked to return home to pick up some personal items. Ernest was chaperoned to his home. When he arrived with his chaperones, he ran from them and got to his shotgun. As he turned the gun on himself, the chaperones caught up and wrestled the firearm away from Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was transferred to the out-of-state Mayo Clinic again for another hospitalization. Halfway through the journey, the plane landed to refuel. Hemingway got out of the plane and tried to walk into the spinning propeller. The pilot cut the engine, thwarting Hemingway's third suicide attempt in 4 days. Around this time, Hemingway believed he was being followed by the FBI. His wife and those around him insisted these were just delusions of an insane man. In truth, years later, it would be revealed that the FBI had been monitoring Hemingway for decades. They had amassed a huge file on the author, who they believed to be a communist sympathizer. When he arrived at the Mayo Clinic, Hemingway received another round of electroconvulsive therapy. He was discharged days later. His wife feared that Ernest had charmed the doctors into believing he was sane. He was not well. Days after arriving back home, Ernest Hemingway woke up before his wife and shot himself in the head. This is not all to say that Ernest Hemingway was a victim. He made a lot of really bad choices. He was a womanizer, an often terrible father, and an ego-obsessed liar. But I do believe we should look deeper than these labels. Whether we categorize Hemingway as a man's man who lived a life of adventure or an alcoholic misogynist, we are equally correct and incorrect. We should consider not just the who of Hemingway, but also the why and the how. We should carry some empathy and compassion into conversations about people, perhaps especially the dead, because they are not here to make their own case. To them, I believe we owe honesty.
Don't keep yourself in the dark like this guy. Lumen, brilliant men's skincare solutions. In the dark when it comes to solutions for oily skin, breakouts, or dark circles under your eyes. Here's a brilliant solution from Lumen, the Class Act Bundle. Lumen makes guys' skincare easy, and it actually works. If you've tried other men's skincare products with disappointing results,